Yeah, hello everyone. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn on this lovely, cold, wet Wednesday. Um, I can see someone's already asked if we will send slides. Yes, we will. We'll send slides. But welcome everybody. I'm Hannah Smith. I'm the head of Fast Responder at Beyond Autism.
And I'm Cynthia Carrier, and I'm an outreach consultant for Beyond Autism.
Cool. So today we're going to be talking about PDA. We really don't like the term pathological, so we'll be avoiding using that term. Yes, so that will be the topic of today, and we'll allow some time at the end for some questions.
Yeah. So it's great to see so many people joining us today. Feel free to pop in the chat where you're listening from. That would be really nice. And like Hannah said, the recording will be available at the end, so don't feel too pressured to make notes. And yeah, if you have any questions or comments, just drop that into the chat and we'll try to get through as many as possible. If we don't have time to, our contacts are at the end of the presentation, so you will have access to reach out to us with any specific questions. So we'll make a start, and what we will be covering today is understanding demand avoidance, looking at those long-term and short-term impacts, going into some strengths of demand avoidance, supporting strategies, things parents would like schools to know, and then at the end we have a book list recommendation for you.
I think just to say, we have only got 25 minutes today, and this is such a huge topic area. So a lot of it might feel a little bit brief, but as I said, and Cynthia said as well, if you've got any questions, you want to discuss it further, we're more than happy to do that, and set up a separate time to do that.
Yeah. So just a little activity to start. If we can all just take 1 minute to have a little think about what behaviours might you engage in if you was presented with an anxiety-provoking situation. So just take some time to pop some answers into the chat. I can say for myself, definitely, I might come a little bit withdrawn in an anxiety-provoking situation. I might be a little bit avoidant to what is being expected of me to do in that situation. So just having a think, because research does suggest that demand avoidance is triggered by an increase in anxiety and a need to manage the environment. So just looking at some of the answers, Hannah.
Yeah, we've had quite a lot of answers already. So obviously there's varying responses. Everyone responds individually to anxiety-provoking situations, but we have got some themes in there. So I can see a lot of people saying avoid, get out, shut down, freeze. Yeah, a lot are coming up: avoid, get away, hide away from people, withdraw. Yes, so it's thinking about that with withdrawing, avoiding, when we're presented with an anxiety-provoking situation. So linking this to PDA, demand avoidance, it's remembering that there's that anxiety around those demands, and that is going to lead to that avoidance.
Yeah. So if we just sort of, like Hannah said, thinking about that and linking it to the environment that you're in. So thinking about that anxiety and pairing it with demand avoidance. Some of the things that you might see are, or that are a bit observable, might be changes in mood, whether that's a slow change in mood or happens really suddenly and really drastic. There may also be an increase in behaviours that challenge, or some might call it behaviours of concern. And that is usually driven from a need to increase predictability. So making that environment a little bit more comfortable and knowing what's sort of coming next. You might also observe some fight or flight responses. You might see some fatigue or exhaustion due to that constant hypervigilance with anticipating demands. So you have that increase in anxiety and you're now hypervigilant because you think that demand is about to happen, but you don't know when. And you might also observe an increase in using distractions or negotiations. And that links back to the point that we mentioned earlier with just trying to increase predictability and trying to have control of that situation. If we now think specifically about what a demand is, just to note that PDA is not a separate diagnosis to autism. However, autistic people can have a profile linked to their diagnosis. So thinking about what a demand is, we can sort of break it up into three main categories. So we have direct demands, and that might be an instruction. For example, put your coat on or sit on a carpet. If you just have a think about how many direct demands we're faced at school or at work and just in everyday life, it's quite a lot. And then you also have indirect or implied demands. And these are questions potentially that you know you need to respond to or you need to have an answer for. Or it could be something like food put in front of you because you're presented with the expectation of needing to eat it. We also have internal demands, and that is willingness to do something for yourself. For example, your bodily needs like hunger, being thirsty, or needing to go to the toilet, or thinking a little bit broadly like the need to fit into social groups. So thinking about directly what they are and the impacts that they can have, demands can be very individualized for each person. So what might feel like a demand for one person may not feel like a demand for somebody else. And demands can change over time. So if you are supporting an autistic person with a PDA profile, it's important to have those notes of what those anxiety-provoking situations are and what some sort of trigger terms might be, but also being aware that that can change over time. So some examples that people might not think are demanding are things like greetings, such as good morning or hello. If we think about if we wake up late and we're running late for work, we've been stuck in traffic, we get in the morning and we're a little bit flustered, the demands of hello, how are you, might feel a little bit stressful for us because we've had those setting events prior. So just being aware of those. Saying the person's name might feel like a demand because, again, it's that expectation that something is about to happen afterwards and the anxiety of not knowing what that is. And another type might just be being asked to not do something. So don't jump on the table or don't run, walk, and things like that. So that they might feel like a demand. So in that sort of last situation with being asked to not do something, you might want to think about letting them know what they could be doing instead. Some common characteristics for autistic people with a PDA profile include resists or avoids typical day-to-day demands, fixated or focused on a particular individual, object or subject, difficulties with executive functioning, for example, grasping schedules or structures, need a sense of predictability, like we previously mentioned, having that need for choices. Offering choices is important whether an autistic person has a PDA profile or not. However, offering a couple of choices and increasing that sort of control may be beneficial to help support that individual. Another characteristic might be mood swings or inflexibility, and also may appear sociable but have some difficulties with receptive language. Now, you wouldn't expect to see every autistic person have all of these characteristics. There may just be a few, or there may be a lot more, but just sort of noting down what those common characteristics are for that autistic person to help inform you with those strategies that you want to think about putting forwards. Just briefly touching on impacts, we do have long-term and short-term impacts of demand avoidance. So just having a look at some of those impacts for the person with the profile, and then also thinking about the impacts that that can have on parents, carers, and teachers. We have difficulties with sleeping, so whether that's getting to sleep, staying asleep, or getting up in the morning, the impact that that may have for a parent, carer, or teacher is impacting on their own sleep. Or for a teacher, you might observe higher anxieties observed in the classroom. With internal distress and difficulties with regulating emotions, what you might see is exhaustion from trying to reduce those demands and finding ways to appropriately support. So with that, you might want to think about having something, whether that's a document that's formally written down or having strategies in place that is consistent across a team to help reduce that exhaustion for parents, carers, and professionals. You might also see difficulties with social groups and maintaining friendships, and the impacts of that may be breakdown in relationships with school or work networks. And the last point is struggling to attend school or work due to burnout and fatigue. If we think about the sort of hypervigilance that we mentioned earlier, this is sort of an impact that can lead on from that. So again, yeah, that might lead to risks of exclusion from schools or termination of employment. And for parents, carers, and teachers, what you might see is just frustration from trying to access that external support network. Again, sort of thinking about those impacts, we have an anxiety loop that can be presented for demands. And what that is specifically is when a demand is placed, and that could be any of the demands that I mentioned earlier, that increases anxiety or distress. And that then leads to avoidance. And from there, you might see behaviors that challenge and those responses that we mentioned in the chat with those anxiety-provoking situations. And after either a behavior that challenges or that avoidance that we might see with that withdrawn or escaping the situation, you might see temporary relief. And that's when the autistic person might slowly go back down to baseline. But then as soon as another demand is presented, we then sort of get stuck in that loop. Now, if you observe that an autistic person is stuck in that loop, what you want to start thinking about here is what proactive strategies that you want to put in place to A, increase predictability in the environment, and B, thinking about what's going to help that autistic person to best cope in that environment. So I will now pass you over to Hannah, who will speak about some strengths and some other lovely, interesting bits.
Thanks, Cynthia. Yeah, I was just having a look at the chat as you were talking, and someone's already brought this up. I think that there is such a negative preconceived idea around a PDA profile, and I think a lot of that is the language that's associated with PDA. I think, I said it at the start, just looking at the term itself, pathological demand avoidance, it already sparks those kind of negative connotations. So it's really important that we as professionals and parents and anyone supporting someone who does have a PDA profile, that we really challenge those negative connotations and that negative language, and make sure that we are focusing on that child's strengths. So these are just some strengths of children that we worked with who do have a PDA profile. There's so many more, obviously. They'll all be individualized to that person themselves. So creative, incredibly creative. All of the children I've worked with who have a PDA profile are very, very creative. Compassionate, independent, charismatic, determined, honest, inquisitive, talented, passionate, loving, imaginative, brave. All of these words that you don't often hear being associated with PDA, someone who has a PDA profile. So really making sure that it's kind of checking your own language, your own preconceptions around PDA as a profile first. Really thinking, okay, how am I perceiving PDA in my head? Are there initially negative words, language terms that are coming up in my head? How can I actually challenge those in my head first? Because that should then help when you're actually then interacting with someone who does have a PDA profile to use more positive language and be more positive in your approaches. So yeah, it's really challenging those when you are coming across other people who might be using negative words, associations like control, manipulative. I've heard those words so many times to associate with someone who's got a PDA profile, and they're so negative. And it prevents actually getting that right support in place and really seeing the individual and their own strengths and who they really are, and looking at it with that anxiety lens that Cynthia's spoken about, rather than it being kind of this pathological negative profile. So yeah, it's just really thinking about challenging those thoughts, those internal thoughts that you may have or that others may have, and really thinking about what are the individual strengths and qualities of that person. So we'll start to speak about some environmental strategies. I think it's important to bring up here when talking about strategies, the PDA Society. If there's anyone on here that isn't actually familiar with the PDA Society, please do have a look on their website. There's lots of guidance and support on strategies on there. So yeah, do have a look. These are some environmental strategies when it comes to reasonable adjustments that have, we've found to be effective when we've worked with some of the children and young people that we support. But ultimately, Cynthia touched on this slightly, we need to identify what is it in the environment that feels demanding for that person. What is it about the environment that we can add adaptations to? What changes can we make rather than focusing on that individual, that person making the changes? They're telling us through their behavior that something is anxiety provoking. So what is it that we can do to actually reduce that anxiety? So thinking about might be creating a hierarchy. So if we're thinking about language is such a big one with PDA and perceptions of demands. So can we create a hierarchy of what those anxiety triggers are? So if it's things being phrased in certain ways, is it about writing out what those phrases are and working with that person to get them to almost rank them from 1 to 10 in terms of what's the most and what's the least anxiety provoking for them? Obviously, as Cynthia said earlier, it will change in terms of perceptions of demand. So it's having those regular check-ins around what feels the most demanding for that person and what feels the least demanding. But ultimately, it's about doing that together with the person themselves, and really understanding what feels most demanding for them and what's more preferred in a way of in terms of language and interacting. Providing low demand spaces. So making sure that we're identifying, again, we've done that hierarchy, not just of language, but also what spaces, environments feel demanding, and making sure that we're creating those spaces for the child themselves, so that if a situation does become too much, too demanding, there's a lower demand space that they have to retreat to, and then agreeing on that exit strategy for them based on what, when they're identifying all those triggers, working with them to try and identify what those triggers are, what those demands are, and then what that exit strategy looks like to support them to use that lower demand space. It might be using certain tools, whether it be headphones, whether it be listening to music, drawing, doing things that they enjoy, that feel fun, feel less anxiety provoking than being in that high demand environment. So yeah, those are some environmental strategies. It's taking a while to load on my screen. But then also thinking about coping strategies and managing anxiety. So as I was saying, ultimately we want to be looking at the environment and what changes we can be making to the environment, rather than kind of really pushing upon coping strategies for a person that's really struggling. We need to make sure that the environment's right first before we can actually teach any of those coping strategies, because if the environment is too anxiety provoking, those coping strategies aren't going to be effective. We need to be doing it teaching them in a proactive space where anxiety is lower. But ultimately it's about collaboration, really working with the child every step of the way, adjusting your own mindset to start with. So thinking about yourself, being flexible, being open, and being collaborative before you're approaching any of these strategies. Relationships are so key. Whenever I've worked with anyone who does have a PDA profile, that is the majority of our time, the majority of the intervention that's going in place is on relationships. If there is not that positive relationship, there is not that trust, you're not going to bring that sense of belonging and connection to really reduce that anxiety. So that's your first step, being creative, carving out time to engage in the child's interests with no expectations on them. So really creating that place of safety and belonging, which will help to increase that communication and for you to better understand what is it that the child really needs, what is it that is really troubling them or causing anxiety, that you can then put adaptations in to support them. I think also something that comes up a lot is friendships. Support with navigating friendships. Some of the children I've worked with, they aren't interested. They're like, nope, I don't really care. But some, it's so important for them, and it's such a big area that if that's not in place, if that support for navigating friendships, and they don't feel that sense of belonging because they haven't got those established friendships in school, that's where we might see some of that resistance to go into school, quite understandably, because friendships are a big part of our school day if that's something that we perceive to be important. So yeah, it's looking at how do we navigate those friendships in school to reduce anxiety and increase that belonging. So who does that child or pupil feel safe with, speaking with them? What do they want from friendships? Is it more about others better understanding their needs? So if they have got some friendships, but there's maybe they're quite fraught friendships, is it about actually supporting those other friends, their peers, their friends, to better understand them as an individual and things that they can do? So yeah, friendship's a big one. Co-regulation, so remembering that's a two-way system. We can't be teaching self-regulation if that co-regulation isn't there. Genuinely empathizing with the individual. I think, most people are going to pick up if you're not being genuine, and an autistic person with a PDA profile, often, my experience, quite hyper aware of your approaches and what's genuine and what's not. So really making sure that you're genuinely listening, genuinely empathizing with them. Showing that it's okay to experience all emotions. It's okay to show them as a parent. It's okay to show them times where you as an adult feel dysregulated. That's okay. It just shows that other people feel the same. It's not just them that are having these these dysregulated experiences, and model regulating behaviours yourself, not necessarily setting those expectations on the child to do the same, because we don't want that to become a demand. But it's modeling that to them. It's showing them that they're not alone. You're there with them, no matter what. And then actively listening. So I think this was absolutely essential to. There was a young person that I supported last year. They'd been out of school for 2 years, and this was key in them actually transitioning back into school, was the active listening. So it was creating a support plan with them in terms of, we created that hierarchy that I've spoken about with demands, and then looking at what strategies and support do they find helpful, and really listening to them, because often they're not really complex. They're quite straightforward. So really listening to them and then showing them actively that you're putting those things in place, having those reviews around the support plan with the pupil themselves, so that they can give their feedback on what they feel is working and what's not working. So yeah, as I say, that was a really key aspect to this young person coming back into school after 2 years out. Empathy, I've touched on empathy. So it's seeing behavior as communication. What is that child actually telling you through their behavior? Being really understanding, being aware, so it might be, I understand what I just did or said made you feel a certain way. What is it that I can do to help or do differently? Being aware that they might not have an answer, and that's okay. But just letting them know that you're there for them, and whether, seeing with them whether they want you to stay or give them space, and allowing them that time to really process. Okay, so I've not got much time, so I ran over slightly, but these were just some key areas that some parents picked out, so parents of children with a PDA profile that we spoke to, that they would like schools to know. So being open to flexibility, thinking about practicalities and language, which I've already spoken about. Adjust your own expectations. Adjust those to that individual, what works for them. Improve your communication with parents. That was a big one that came up. So it might be that there's certain changes in the school day that might be coming up, communicating those with parents, because it might be, otherwise that they can do that sort of preparation work around something that might be anxiety provoking that's coming up. And it helps them to just have that better awareness. Autism training for parents and for learners, so for the pupils in school, linking in PDA into that. That's feedback that I've also had from some of the young people that I've worked with. They say, I just wish the pupils, not just the pupils in school, but the teachers really got it and really understood what autism looks like for me and what PDA looks like. Support with friendships, collaboration, and smaller group activities, making those available. So if those larger classroom-based activities are too demanding, having those smaller based group activities available in schools. These were books that a parent recommended. So if you're a parent or professional and you'd like to read more, these are particular books that they'd find helpful. So one called Can You See Me? And then one called Can I Tell You About Pathological Demand Avoidance Syndrome? So yeah, those are the ones that they'd found particularly helpful themselves. I mentioned PDA Society. So yeah, thank you everyone for listening. As I said, it's it's such a big topic area, and we only had such a small amount of time today to cover what we've been able to cover. But I'm sure there's lots of questions in the chat. I'll try and answer one. But if we're not able to answer yours, then we can follow them up with an email. So all of the questions in the chat will have been saved, and we'll be able to respond on there. Just before I try and come to one of the questions. So next session will be on the 22nd of March with Rachel Homador. That will be on overcoming challenges associated with toileting. So do sign up if that would be of support to you. And then just to mention our professional conference. So we've got our 4th annual professional conference happening in April, which is Leading Autism Education, Shaping Education for and with Autistic Learners. So for those that have attended today, you can get 15% off tickets using the code LunchLearn15. You can have a look on our website, just type in professional conference, or you can use the QR code. I almost forgot that's there. And then also to reference our stakeholder consultation. So we're currently looking towards our next 5-year strategy, and would really like to hear from you in terms of informing that strategy moving forward. So if that's something you're interested in, please do scan the QR code there. Okay, I'm going to do one question. Is there one question, Dan, I could do?
We've got one here that says, how do you help a child out of autistic burnout?
Okay, that's quite a good question. And I think, I'm not sure where that came in, but I think it's remembering that that co-regulation that I spoke about. It's really understanding what demands are triggering. So it's kind of going back a step first, understanding what is it that's anxiety provoking that leads to that burnout. And then really, really working with that child themselves to put together a plan. But yeah, when it does happen itself, it's that co-regulation, it's being present, letting them know you're there for them, really empathizing, and then actively listening from there. I hope that was helpful. Sorry, I couldn't take more questions.
We will try to get back to it.
But yeah, we'll make sure we get all of them answered. We'll follow up via email. So yeah, thank you everybody, and have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you everyone.